Now, this week, the Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland, announced a proposed overhaul of sentencing laws. Among the new suggestions are a potential whole-life tariff for murderers under the age of 21 and plans to ensure dangerous criminals complete at least two-thirds of their sentence instead of being eligible for release halfway through.
The new rules could see more people spending longer in prison, a move welcomed by many victims groups. But are tougher sentencing laws the way to go? With whole-life tariffs, is there any room for redemption? And should prisons be more about punishment or rehabilitation? Here to discuss those issues are journalist and former prisoner Chris Atkins, solicitor Ayesha Nayyar, chaplain and former prisoner Reverend Jonathan Aitken, and journalist Chante Joseph. Welcome to all of you.
Ayesha, we'll start with you. The government want to get tougher on sentencing of criminals, but prisons are overcrowded. Many people think they don't work. Is it really a good idea to send people to prison for longer?
Well, I think the starting point is looking at why we send people to prison. Now, prison has a number of different facets to it. First and primarily, it is to punish. Secondly, it is to get dangerous people off our streets. Thirdly, it's to act as an effective deterrent to anybody thinking about committing a crime. And then fourthly is, as you absolutely rightly said, to look to rehabilitate anybody who has committed an offence. What you have to remember is prison is reserved for the most serious of offenders. Judges don't like sending people to prison. So if you've ended up in prison, there's a reason that you are there. And depending on what angle you come from, I come to this programme from a victim's perspective. And for us, sending somebody to prison helps their rehabilitation process as well. So should somebody be sent to prison and should they go for longer? Well, it depends on the type of crime that they commit. And the white paper that you've talked about deals with violent offenders. So, for example, as you quite rightly said, passing whole life orders for anybody who commits a murder of a child, quite rightly, they should go to prison. And then increasing the tariff for repeat offenders, reducing the 50% automatic release point and increasing that to 2/3 for violent offenders. So from my perspective, longer sentences do work for violent offenders.
So, Chris, you spent time in prison for fraud. I suppose there's two parts to the questions. Firstly, do you think that you, by spending time in prison, you paid your reparation? And secondly, are prisons places that help people turn their lives around?
My situation is probably very different from a lot of people because I ended up writing a book called A Bit of a Stretch about my time in prison, and I've been promoting that ever since I got out and trying to argue for more sort of humane criminal justice. So my situation, I think, is quite sort of different from most people. Do prisons work as a whole for most people in there? No, I don't think they do, because a huge number of people in prison are mentally ill, and that's one of the reasons that sent them to prison in the first place. Just coming to this point about deterrent, I've actually spent the last year interviewing former prisoners about their time in prison. I've spoken to about 20 ex-offenders. And the deterrent thing is a myth. People like that who are going to commit a crime aren't thinking of the consequences properly, and they also think they're going to get away with it. So the idea that they think they're facing half their sentence versus 2/3 their sentence versus 3/4 their sentence, it's a total myth. They're not thinking of the consequences at all. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. So the idea that prison works as a deterrent is, as far as I'm concerned, a nonsense, because people don't think about it before they commit the crime. But also the idea that it rehabilitates is also completely false, because so many people leave prison far more damaged than when they went in and go on and commit more crimes, creating more victims, which is why we have some of the highest reoffending rates in Europe.
OK, Reverend Jonathan, you've spent time in prison as well for perjury, but you welcome potentially tougher sentencing laws. How have you come to a different conclusion to Chris?
I think that the white paper we're talking about is really in two parts. There are some tougher sentences and there's some smarter sentences which will actually maybe reduce the prison population. On the tougher sentences point, I don't think it's necessarily wrong for a government or a society to say, maybe in the interest of victims, that there are certain crimes which shouldn't automatically result in releases at 50% of the time served. I think this is illogical that we have such a system at the moment. And the idea that you should, in some circumstances, keep, say, terrorists in until they've served 2/3 of their sentences, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Coming to the smarter sentences point, there's a lot of quite good news in this white paper, things which are not discussed easily, but things called problem-solving courts, more powers for the probation service, all kinds of changes to the Offender Rehabilitation Act, which will actually, I think, keep a lot of minor offenders out of prisons. And I particularly welcome the notion that there will be judicial monitoring through problem-solving courts, so that drug offenders in particular may not necessarily go automatically back to prison for petty breaches of the law. So there's tough news, but also cleverer news in this white paper.
Shante, you're quite opposed to this white paper. Why is that?
I think I'm just opposed to prisons in general. Like, I'm a huge advocate of prison abolition. We know that sentences have been getting tougher for the past 3 decades with little to no impact on crime or on public confidence of crime. So all it does is lead to crowded prisons, and we know that people going to prison and coming out have their lives completely decimated. I think it also relies on this very binary idea of a victim and perpetrator narrative, whereas we know that, for example, 70% of the women who are currently in prison are survivors of domestic abuse, and that a lot of the time when they come out of prison or when they go to prison, 90% of the time their kids get taken away from them. So then what does that mean for the children who have their lives disrupted? And then how does that affect them in school? And then how does that contribute to the school to prison pipeline? So I think when we think about prisons and we think about kind of ideas of delivering justice, we tell kids all the time, don't fight fire with fire, right? And then we have a justice system that does just that. And we rely so much on this punitive measure when we keep thinking of crime as something that is innate in people. We're innately bad, so we must be punished. However, we need to look at crime as a response to need.
Well, let's put some of those points to Ayesha. I mean, we've had lots of people getting in touch on social media. Doreen on Facebook. She agrees with you, actually, Ayesha. At the end of the day, it is the safety of the public which is the most important. But what about those points Shante makes? It's too simplistic to say it's just the victim and the perpetrator of the crime. That's what you said in your opening gambit. It's about the victim. It's too simplistic.
It's not at all. Look, you're talking about acting as a deterrent. One statistic and fact that you can't get away from is you take a violent person off the street and you put them in prison, violence will go down. We'll take burglars as an example.
But if it doesn't, I'm sorry, it doesn't.
Aisha, if they come back and commit a crime, then the prison hasn't done its job. Just let's hear Aisha.
Let's take burglars, for example. They repeat offend 5 times. They are career criminals. Most burglars are career criminals. Statistics show you take a known burglar out of a certain area and the period of time he's in prison, robberies, burglaries in that area drop right down. And also, just going back to the point, we don't need prisons. Well, you need prisons and a longer stretch to be able to effectively rehabilitate whilst you're in prison. There's no point having a short prison sentence. There's not enough time to rehabilitate while you're in there. And I think there's always a lot of talk about prisoners. But what about the general public? We want justice as well. And for us, we get a lot of satisfaction of seeing dangerous people locked away. And that in itself has to be done.
So, Reverend Jonathan, excuse me, Chris. So, Reverend Jonathan, it's said that people want justice for others and mercy for themselves. What do you think about this? Do you think that there's more opportunity to work with a prisoner and rehabilitate them? Do you think prison can be an effective rehabilitation centre for people?
Yes, it definitely can. I'm a prison chaplain, so I'm sort of in the rehabilitation business, if you like. But not just me. I mean, there are probation officers, there are very good prison officers, all of whom are very interested in rehabilitating prisoners. And although the system to some extent militates against it, you have to balance punishment, sometimes quite severe, long sentence punishment for dangerous people, but also you have to have a system which rehabilitates. And one good thing about this white paper, it does, for the first time that I can remember, put some considerable emphasis on new ideas for rehabilitating.
What's the point of being rehabilitated if you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison? Can you have a fulfilled life in prison?
Well, I think we're talking here about 2 completely different kinds of offenders. Those who are going to spend the entire life in prison are people like mass murderers, serial killers, terrorists, and so on. They're a very small percentage of the prison population. Over half the prison population are very low-level offenders who get very short sentences. And they deserve consideration too, as to what is the best way of both protecting the public and punishing them and rehabilitating them. And there are some new ideas in this white paper, such as problem-solving courts, which are very widespread in North America, hardly begun at all.
Reverend Jonathan, we're running out of time, and I really want to try and get the others in. There's a funny sort of hand popping into your screen as well. I noticed. People might notice that at home. Chris, can you be rehabilitated in prison?
Not at the moment.
But what about
no.
you? You've done well.
I'm the exception that proves the rule. So I've got a book out, I've got a podcast where I interview ex-prisoners, but a huge number of prisoners are mentally ill, okay, and they're addicted to drugs, and that is the root cause of their offending. Prison does nothing for them other than lock them in a box for 23 hours a day and not give them any treatment whatsoever. The only treatment they can get is drugs, which they can buy, so they self-medicate, and that perpetuates. You talk about repeat offenders. Well, that's why we have repeat offenders, because prison is doing nothing for them.
Last question to Shante. Sorry, Chris. Last question to Shante. What is the best way of getting prisoners off getting criminals off the street and keeping the public safe?
Well, it's certainly not prisons. Obviously, I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that the way that we do justice at the moment only serves to create more crime. And the best way to prevent crime or to prevent people from creating harm towards others is by investing in things like education, in healthcare, in social care. It's not about sending people away. It's about dealing with social deprivation and social issues.
I'm sorry to have to finish it there. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining.